We're now going to turn our attention to England. Last class, we started the Romantic movement in France and we moved to Spain. Today, we looked at Fuseli, who's a Swiss-born artist who established a career in England, and then we turned to Germany. Let's turn back to England, and I want to introduce you to a concept or some context before we look at our next couple of artists. Concept is the Industrial Revolution. Now, I give you a definition here to help anchor us in how we're going to be looking at the artworks today. The Industrial Revolution, the transition from an agricultural society to one dependent on complex machinery and commercialism. It began in England in the mid-1700s with the invention of the steam engine. Now, here, this map I've shown you is the larger European continent and highlighting the main early railroad lines. I want you to notice that while the United Kingdom is relatively small in comparison, it has the most railroad lines. And that is because the invention of the steam engine and its use in locomotion trains first established itself in England. Now, the reason I emphasize the use of trains and the invention of the steam engine is because trains are often used in art as a symbol of modernity. It is this new concept of not only the locomotion, the steam engine that moves something, but it also introduces new concepts of time and space and speed and strength. With the train, we could now carry more things and more people than before, and we can take them farther and faster than ever before. It's the reason why we have the system of time zones is because in England they wanted to have a more efficient understanding of the time it would take for a train to get from one area to another and have a more predictable schedule for that material, goods, people. The trains not only are a symbol of modernity because of time, but space and our concept of power, manpower, or horsepower. Did you ever wonder why we talk about cars, engines in terms of how many horses they have? It's because it's direct relation to literal horses, and the steam engine was measured by its power against a horse. With the Industrial Revolution and the steam engine, we see the use of trains and this idea of going faster and farther than ever before. We also see the steam engine used to replace manpower. Manpower in the form of factories. Here we are looking at an early factory in England, and we see that this factory is meant to be a mass production of goods. And this mass production of goods means more stuff can be made for cheaper because you're not paying for manual labor. If things are made cheaper and there are more of them, that means we can buy more stuff. Do you see how the Industrial Revolution leads to a modern thinking? Oh, it's so cheap, I can afford it. Yay! But with factories, we also see, or I should say, with industrialization, we also see the other side of the issues. This leads to factories and pollution, like we see here, the heavy billows of black smoke from the soot of the coal being burned. We see the rapid destruction of natural resources, and we see the displacement of people and a loss of community and a loss of craftsmanship. What do you mean by the displacement of people? Well, as the steam engine replaces manpower, people are out of jobs and they seek employment in the cities and in the factories. And what we have is an overwhelming amount of people flooding these urban environments. And there isn't enough space for them. There isn't enough housing. There isn't enough resources of food and water and waste management. And so we see this overcrowding of urban environments. And with that, also a sense of displacement, loss of community. I know, I just said that, but what do I mean by that? Imagine being in a village that your family has lived in for hundreds of years, and now you're out of a job and you move into the city, a place you've never been before. You've never been outside of the confines of your village property, and you don't know anybody here in this city. What we see during the Industrial Revolution is increasing sense of alienation. We see an increasing abuse of alcohol and drugs and a rise in crime. And without the tools to help these people in these cities, this is just going to increase and get worse and worse and worse. The factories are not only going to be sites of industry and production and massive amounts of wealth, but these factories are also going to be belching out lots of toxic waste into the rivers. And as I said before, they're going to be abusing the natural resources, and the landscape is going to change both physically and with the loss of people. We start to see in England almost an immediate abandonment of village life for the cities, which is a challenge to identity. How does this relate to art? Our next artist, Constable. John Constable. His artwork is definitely a part of the Romantic movement, but he will be tapping into the Industrial Revolution as it affects England as well. Look at the self-portrait. Isn't he so cute? This young man with little rosy cheeks. Here's our artwork by Constable. This is titled The Hay Wain. Hay wain is another word for a hay wagon, and that's what we're seeing here. We got a wagon. The shallow lip of the wagon is to allow for a big mound of hay. There's no hay in it. Okay. Well, let's look at what else is here. We have a beautiful English countryside. We see a lazy, shallow river. We're standing on one side of the riverbank, looking across to this beautiful green landscape, or I should say more specifically, a field. We see some people bending down, harvesting a field. See some ducks in the water. Look at here. Somebody's got a canoe they can easily take across. Over here we see a little girl dipping her toes or dipping her fingers into the water. Here's a dog. There's a man and a boy on this cart being pulled. Okay, cool. There's a charming little cottage here on the other side. Nice. What about this is romantic? There's no death. There's no fire. Okay, good question. Let's talk about it after I introduce you to your next vocabulary term. En plein air. Constable wanted to give you a real feeling of being here in this space. And so to be as accurate as possible, he painted en plein air. It's French, and it means in the open air. It's the practice of painting outdoors to capture the fleeting effects of light and atmosphere while working directly with nature. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Miss Cortez, didn't they always do that? No. Believe it or not, no. Most of the time, you would do your sketches, and then you would do all of the coloring and light in the studio. You'd be like, yeah, I know what it looks like. And then you go back in the studio and do it. Constable would like to do his practice studies in color, typically watercolor. And he wanted to get those expressions of clouds and the movement of them across the sky. He wanted to really have you feel like you could hear the wind through the trees, and you could hear the dabble of the river. You could smell the green of the grass and the dust and the dirt. He wanted us to feel like we were really there. These are just some of his sketches of things like clouds. It seems like pretty basic and boring, but what he's trying to do is get the sense of sunlight and shadow and the movement of a heavy, thick cloud across the sky. Look at this one here on the ocean, how the shadows are cast onto the hillside. These are basic elements of light and shadow, but they're so easily ignored when you don't work on plein air. If you're just working in the studio, you're not going to think about these types of elements of light and movement. He wants you to really understand it. So much so that we know exactly where he stood when he painted this. It's a river in Suffolk, England. More specifically, let me look at my notes. It's in Suffolk near Flatford on the River Stour, S-T-O-U-R. And check it out. The cottage is still there. The river bend, still there. There is the same bunch of trees and that beautiful field in the distance. So we feel like we're really there because it's a real space, and he's going to use kind of pure emotion and feeling of standing on that river. What do I mean by pure emotion and feeling? Look at this is the river, and he would often use just like dabs of pure white to give you that shimmer and pop of the sunlight. Have you ever stood next to a river and then had that kind of zing, blinding reflection from the sun? So he's giving us those pop, pop, pop. So he works in plein air to make us feel like we're really standing there. Now, let's think about this in terms of the Romantic period. What kind of sounds and smells? You feel like you're there. Okay, that's Romanticism. How does this relate to what I just said about the Industrial Revolution? Well, there's definitely no factories here. We have a cottage. We have perhaps father and son. Now it's titled the Hay Wain, but they don't have any hay, so maybe they just sold their hay at the market. And they're traveling back across the meadow home after a successful sale of their hay. That dog on the other side, barking. Kids saying, "Hey, stop it, go quiet." There's nothing extraordinary going on. It's just simple village life, isn't it? But isn't that what's disappearing? The sky is blue and clean. No pollution. The river isn't filled with toxic waste. What Constable's doing here is he's romanticizing village life. You know what I mean by romanticizing, right? Like think about when your friend was in that terrible relationship with that person and they finally broke up with them. And then later on they're like, "Oh, they weren't so bad. We had some good times." And you're like, "No, you're romanticizing the past." That's what he's doing here. He's romanticizing village life because it's rapidly disappearing in England. People are leaving the villages. These rivers will be flooded with waste. The skies will be black with soot. This simple, slow-paced way of life is not going to be around much longer. So it's a way of saying, "Oh, remember the simple times? Remember how good it used to be?" Here's another one of Constable's paintings that does the same kind of romanticism of village life. Here it is. It's called the White Horse. Again, on the other side of a riverbank, we see a slow-moving stream. It's called the White Horse because there's a white horse. This white horse is being ferried across the river, so the river must be too deep for the horse to walk across by himself. We see the ferrymen, and they're pushing down the river, probably to this dock over here. In the distance, we see a village, a charming English village. Small, not an overpopulated city. We see some cows have stopped grazing to come down to the river. We can almost hear the rattle of their cowbell and the low moos, right? So again, Constable is romanticizing the slow pace of village life, of what it used to be. The horse going across the river might have been the most important thing that happened that day, or the most significant thing, the most interesting thing. Again, he's romanticizing it. I'm not saying that there was no crime, there was no addiction, there was no abuse of power in the village life, but he's romanticizing it. Your cousins might have been getting into all of your business and you had no privacy, sure, but the rivers were clean and the skies were blue, and instead of worrying about where I was going to find my next meal or worrying about paying the rent, all I had to do was worry if that horse got across the river. And of course it would. So Constable is using the idea of romanticism to pull these emotions from us, because we are rapidly losing this way of life because of the Industrial Revolution.